The mountains had a way of humbling people. They loomed over the valley with a quiet, insistent dominance, their peaks scraping the clouds, their slopes cloaked in dense pine forests. Down in the lower meadows, neighbors of all sorts, farmers, loggers, and weekend adventurers, lived their lives believing they understood the mountain's moods. They didn't. Not really. Not until the mudslide came. Tommy Harlan was 15 when he decided to build his cabin. Not just any cabin, but one that seemed to tilt ever so slightly, 15 degrees to be exact, on the edge of a rocky ridge where the ground sloped and the earth seemed unstable. To his neighbors, it was a ridiculous idea. A dare, perhaps, or the recklessness of a kid who hadn't learned how gravity worked. "You're crazy, Harlan," Old Man Jenkins had said one afternoon, shaking his head as he leaned against his rusted pickup. "That cabin's gonna topple the first time a storm blows through. You mark my words." Tommy had just smiled. He had the kind of quiet confidence that drove adults crazy. Not arrogance. He wasn't that kind of boy, but a stubborn certainty that he saw something they couldn't. Something that didn't require understanding from the rest of the world. The neighbors had their bets. Bets whispered over fences and at the local diner, bets that involved everything from a collapsed roof to a broken leg. They didn't respect Tommy mostly because he didn't care for the unspoken rules of their tight-knit valley society. He wore patched jeans, carried a tattered backpack, and spent more time with a hammer and saw than with any friends his age. He built his cabin by hand, raising every plank with meticulous precision, his hands blistered and his back sore. "You know that thing, leaning like a drunk, right?" Mrs. Calloway called out one afternoon as she drove past in her minivan, a sour expression on her face. "One gust of wind and it's coming down on someone's car." Tommy waved almost politely. "It's fine, trust me." "Trust you?" Mrs. Calloway laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "You can't even keep your cat from wandering into my yard without it tearing up my garden." The valley laughed with her, and yet Tommy continued. Every day after school he climbed the ridge. The earth smelled of wet pine and stone. The air was crisp, tangy, and a little dangerous when the wind picked up. He moved his planks into place, checked the angles, and tapped nails in with a rhythm that could only be described as obsessive love. To him, the tilt wasn't a flaw, it was an intentional defiance against the predictability of nature, a small rebellion against the rules that bound everyone else. His father had passed away when Tommy was 12, leaving him and his mother with nothing but a modest farmhouse and a mountain of memories. His mother, Elaine, understood Tommy's stubbornness more than anyone, though she worried constantly. "Just be careful," she said one evening as the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and violet. "I don't care what the world says, I just don't want you hurt." "I'm fine, Mom," Tommy replied, wiping sawdust from his hands. "I've got it figured out." But even Tommy couldn't ignore the storm clouds gathering that week. The weather had been uncharacteristically heavy, with rain hammering the slopes like fists, softening the soil and turning the creek into a roaring snake of brown water. Neighbors huddled inside, muttering about the mountain's temper, checking their roofs and stacking sandbags. One afternoon, as the rain pelted down in relentless sheets, Tommy stood in his cabin doorway, staring at the valley below. The tilt of the cabin made it feel precarious, like a ship in a stormy sea, but he trusted his work. He had anchored every post, reinforced every corner, and calculated angles that no one else had bothered to consider. The neighbors, peeking through their windows and curtains, whispered among themselves, eyes wide with worry. "Mark my words," Old Man Jenkins muttered to Mrs. Calloway, who had come by with her umbrella. "That boy's gonna end up in a hospital or worse." But Tommy didn't hear them. He was already thinking ahead, imagining the cabin as a fortress of resilience, a place where storms could crash against the walls and yet leave him unscathed. There was a strange pride in that thought, a small, secret triumph that no one else could see. And then it began, the subtle, terrifying shift of earth under the mountain's skin. It started as a whisper, a faint cracking that Tommy noticed first while fetching firewood. He froze, listening. The tilt of the cabin didn't seem to change, but the ground shifted in ways that made the hair on his neck stand on end. Rocks loosened, roots popped out of the mud, and a low, grinding rumble echoed through the ridge. He ran back to the cabin, his heart hammering, and peered through the window. Below, a thin trickle of mud was already forming, sliding down the slope in lazy, dangerous curves. The rain had softened the soil more than even the forecasts had predicted. Tommy's mind raced. He had seen slides before, studied them in books and videos late at night. But he had never imagined one coming so close, so fast, to the very cabin he had built. His hands shook slightly, not with fear, but with a sharpened adrenaline that made every decision precise. He thought of his mother, her worry-lined face, and he realized the truth. He couldn't run to anyone else for this. If the cabin survived, it would be because of him, and the angles, the calculations, the careful planning that everyone had mocked. The mudslide grew bolder, picking up speed, consuming loose stones and tearing at the young pines that dared to stand in its path. From the ridge, it looked like a living, brown serpent, glinting with water under the fleeting sun. Neighbors, alarmed, ran to their windows and cameras, ready to record the collapse of what they had mocked for years. And yet, it didn't hit the cabin. Not even a splash. The slide flowed past with astonishing precision, almost as if it knew where the cabin stood, as if the tilted angles of Tommy's work were guiding it along a path of avoidance. Mud and debris tore down the mountainside, swallowing fences, uprooting small trees and flattening a few sheds that hadn't been built with care, but the cabin remained steadfast. The neighbors' jaws dropped, eyes wide in disbelief. Tommy, standing in the doorway, felt something strange. Relief, triumph, and yes, a quiet, private satisfaction that no mocking voice could take from him. He stepped outside, boots sinking slightly into wet soil, and raised his arms as if to greet the storm itself. Mrs. Calloway, dripping and speechless, finally found her voice. I don't understand." Old man Jenkins just shook his head, muttering something under his breath about luck and divine intervention. But deep down, even he had to acknowledge the truth. That cabin, built at a 15-degree tilt, had outsmarted nature in a way that defied their understanding. Tommy didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He just stood there, heart pounding, watching the mountain reclaim its fury, knowing that he had faced it and survived, not by chance, but by trust in himself, in his hands, and in the strange geometry that everyone else had laughed at. That night, when the rain slowed to a drizzle, neighbors gathered quietly near the ridge. They didn't come to mock anymore. They came to stare in awe. Some whispered apologies. Others just shook their heads, unable to explain what they had just witnessed. And Tommy? He went back to his cabin, his refuge and his proof that stubbornness, when tempered with knowledge, could be a shield stronger than any wall or roof. But even as the stars emerged from behind the storm clouds, a new fear began to creep into Tommy's mind. The mountain wasn't done yet. The mudslide had been a warning, not a finale. And he knew, deep down, that nature had only just started testing him. Yet for now, in that moment of quiet, there was hope. There was victory. And above all, there was the knowledge that sometimes the world's laughter was just a prelude to its awe. The morning after the mudslide, the valley felt different. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin, sharp and alive. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a glossy sheen on the rocks and a low mist that hugged the slopes like a ghost. Birds cautiously returned to their nests, and a distant deer peered through the fog, ears twitching at the silence that had replaced yesterday's chaos. Tommy was already up before sunrise, boots crunching on the damp soil as he circled the cabin, checking for any sign of damage. Every nail, every board, every precarious angle held firm. It was miraculous, but he didn't see it as luck. To him, it was validation, proof that years of studying, experimenting, and understanding the mountain's hidden rhythms were worth every blister, every sleepless night. By the time neighbors began emerging from their homes, their expressions were cautious, some blending awe with embarrassment. The valley had become a quiet stage, with Tommy and his tilted cabin at center, the unspeaking mountains as witness. "Morning, Harlan," called Mr. Peterson from across the dirt road, his voice awkward, uncertain. Seems like your cabin did all right." Tommy didn't rise to the condescension. He just nodded. "It's fine." "But you were lucky, kid. That thing could have been gone in seconds," Mr. Peterson continued, gesturing vaguely toward the scarred slope. "The slide, it was bad." Tommy shrugged, though inside he was processing more than luck. The mudslide had revealed the mountain's hidden channels, the secret paths water and debris followed. He had built the cabin along those invisible lines, adjusting the tilt to align with the flow of earth in ways the neighbors would never notice. They would never understand. Not yet. The valley started boozy. Word spread faster than wildfire in dry grass. By mid-morning, strangers, hikers, journalists, even a handful of thrill-seekers began arriving, cameras in hand. They snapped pictures of the tilted cabin and filmed shaky footage of the mudslide's scar. Everyone wanted to know how the boy had survived what looked like certain disaster. Elaine Harlan, Tommy's mother, tried to manage the attention, gently ushering some visitors down the ridge and politely declining interviews. But even she couldn't hide her pride. She watched Tommy calmly explain to a small crowd how he had studied the slope and the flow of water. He spoke with confidence, using words that hinted at the depth of his understanding while remaining accessible. A local reporter, a wiry woman named Sandy Morales with a notebook stuffed in her jacket pocket, edged closer. "Tommy, can you explain? Why tilt the cabin at all? Most engineers would never consider it." Tommy looked at her, eyes steady. "Because sometimes you have to work with nature, not against it. The tilt isn't a mistake. It's how the cabin talks to the mountain." Sandy blinked, startled by the philosophical undertone. The crowd murmured, impressed, confused, and slowly realizing that the boy who had been mocked for years had somehow outsmarted both gravity and disaster. Meanwhile, the neighbors reacted differently. Some were impressed, albeit grudgingly. Others, like Mrs. Calloway and Old Man Jenkins, were silent, muttering to each other. Old Man Jenkins shook his head as he scuffed at the dirt with his boot. "I don't know what kind of math that kid's doing, but I'll be damned if he didn't pull it off." The valley schoolyard buzzed with news. Tommy's classmates had mixed reactions, a few envious, many astonished, and a handful genuinely worried for him. Kids who had once thrown stones at his windows to see if they'd knock his cabin off balance now whispered apologies and sought to understand his methods. For Tommy, it didn't matter. Recognition was fleeting. Understanding wasn't necessary. He only needed the mountain to stay in its place, and for now it had. Yet life, as it always does, insisted on moving forward. The mudslide had caused damage elsewhere, roads blocked, fences destroyed, and several livestock pens flattened. Volunteers from the valley worked through the day, repairing what they could, clearing debris and tending to frightened animals. Tommy helped too, his hands steady despite the adrenaline still humming in his veins. The cabin had survived, but the valley hadn't been so fortunate. As evening approached, the sun broke through the clouds in sharp, golden beams. Tommy climbed to the small platform he had built alongside his cabin. From there he could see the full extent of the mudslide's path, an angry scar of brown and gray winding down the mountain, ripping apart parts of the valley below, and then fading into the forest. The destruction was significant, but the path had narrowly missed several homes, including his mother's. Elaine joined him, wrapping a worn blanket around his shoulders. She didn't speak immediately. She just held him, feeling the warmth of him against the chill of the evening. "You did good, Tommy," she finally said, her voice tight with emotion. "Better than anyone imagined." Tommy smiled faintly, leaning against the cabin. "It's not just me. It's the slope, the tilt, the mountain. We work together." She laughed softly, the sound tinged with relief. "Work together, huh? Well, I suppose it's better than trying to fight it." They stayed like that, watching the shadows creep along the valley floor until the first stars began to glimmer. Tommy's mind, however, didn't rest. The mudslide had been a warning. Even as he celebrated the victory, he knew there were other challenges lurking. Storms that could be worse, shifts in the mountain that could test his skills further, and the constant scrutiny of a valley that had gone from mockery to fascination overnight. Later that night, Tommy lay in his cabin, staring at the ceiling, thinking through angles and weights and drainage paths. He ran calculations in his head, imagining worst-case scenarios, predicting how another slide might behave. Sleep came only in brief, restless waves, punctuated by dreams of shifting earth and roaring torrents. He had survived this trial, but the mountain demanded vigilance. And the neighbors, they slept uneasily too. Whispers and debates had replaced laughter. The boy who had tilted his cabin wasn't just eccentric anymore. He was a symbol, a challenge to their understanding of nature and gravity. Some began to rethink their own buildings, their own assumptions, and even their judgment of children. Tommy had shifted something in their minds, whether they wanted to admit it or not. By morning, the valley's energy had transformed. No longer was Tommy the boy to be laughed at. He was the boy who had faced the mountain and lived to tell the tale. Invitations to SPI, K at local schools, interviews with regional news outlets, and even the curious interest of engineering students began to find their way to his door. But Tommy kept his priorities simple. Inspect the cabin, check the surrounding soil, and prepare for the next challenge. Recognition was fleeting. Survival, precision, and understanding were permanent. And the mudslide? It had changed more than just the terrain. It had reshaped the valley's perception of what was possible. In that quiet mountain community, where tradition often overshadowed innovation, a 15-year-old boy had shown that careful observation, a bit of audacity, and trust in one's own work could defy not just expectation, but nature itself. Yet the mountain, as always, remained silent. Its next test was inevitable, waiting beyond the horizon, and Tommy, though victorious this time, felt it simmering beneath the earth. There would be another mudslide, another storm, and perhaps a challenge that even the cleverest angles couldn't foresee. For now, though, the valley exhaled. The cabin stood as proof, stubborn and tilted, that sometimes the things mocked the most are the very things that survive. Spring arrived slowly in the valley, the mountain still raw from the mudslide but alive with renewal. Green shoots pushed through the scarred earth, and the creek, once brown and angry, sang a steady, clear song again. But Tommy Harlan didn't take the rebirth lightly. If the mudslide had taught him anything, it was that nature's mercy was fleeting, and its tests never entirely over. The valley had changed, too. The neighbors who had mocked him now approached with a mixture of curiosity and quiet respect, though some of that respect was edged with envy. Children whispered in the schoolyard, and even adults lingered a little longer when Tommy passed, sometimes asking questions about his methods. But no one could replicate what he had done. That cabin, the tilted, stubborn fortress, remained uniquely his. One afternoon, Tommy's solitude was broken by a knock on the cabin door. He opened it to find two local engineers, hard hats in hand and notebooks bristling with diagrams. "Mr. Harlan," one of them said, a tall man with a lined face and sharp eyes. "We're here to study your cabin. It's unusual. We want to understand how it withstood the mudslide." Tommy leaned against the doorframe, studying them for a moment. He had expected this kind of attention eventually, though not so soon, and certainly not so formally. "Come in," he said finally. "But you should know, I didn't do anything magical, just calculated angles and drainage. The rest was trust." They followed him inside, and Tommy began walking them through every corner, every post, every carefully reinforced beam. He explained how the tilt worked to guide runoff, how he had calculated the center of gravity to minimize risk, and how the cabin's foundations interacted with the bedrock beneath. The engineers scribbled notes furiously, their eyes wide with admiration. One of them, a woman with a ponytail and thick-rimmed glasses, finally looked up. "You're 15, and you did all this?" Tommy shrugged. "I've always liked building things. My dad taught me a little, books taught me a lot, and the mountain, well, the mountain taught the rest." Their admiration was genuine, but Tommy didn't linger on it. He had learned long ago that the work mattered more than recognition. Still, a small part of him swelled with quiet pride. He had done something remarkable, not because he wanted fame, but because he refused to let fear dictate his actions. While the engineers examined the cabin, the valley's attention began to grow in more unexpected ways. Social media had caught wind of the story, and soon videos of Tommy's tilted cabin went viral. People marveled at the audacity, the skill, and the sheer luck-defying placement. Comment sections were filled with awe, admiration, and a surprising number of engineers debating angles and techniques. Tommy didn't understand most of it. He wasn't interested in fame, but he watched as the story of his stubborn little cabin spread across the country. Meanwhile, the mountain reminded him that respect for nature wasn't optional. One rainy night, Elaine woke to the sound of trees groaning and small rocks tumbling down the ridge. Tommy sprang into action, grabbing his raincoat and flashlight. He ran outside, heart pounding, and scanned the slope. The storm wasn't as fierce as the mudslide months ago, but it was enough to trigger small slides along weakened soil. Tommy moved quickly, assessing the risks and shoring up vulnerable areas with sandbags and wooden braces. The cabin swayed slightly in the wind, but it held. By the time the storm passed, he was soaked to the bone, exhausted but relieved. The cabin had endured again. The following morning, neighbors came over, not with mockery, but with offers of help. Old man Jenkins brought heavy-duty ropes and tarps. Mrs. Calloway carried hot coffee and blankets. It was the first time Tommy realized that the same people who had laughed at him now respected not just his skill, but his courage and dedication. "You handled that like a pro, kid," old man Jenkins said gruffly, patting Tommy on the shoulder. "Wouldn't have survived that without quick thinking." Tommy nodded, appreciating the sentiment but not letting it inflate his ego. He knew the mountain could always take more than it gave, and he wasn't done learning. Days turned into weeks, and the valley slowly repaired the damage left by the previous mudslide. Roads were cleared, fences rebuilt, and livestock tended. Yet the tilted cabin remained the centerpiece, a symbol of resilience that drew a mix of admiration, envy, and curiosity. Tourists began arriving, some respectfully, some nosily. Tommy's sanctuary became a public spectacle, and he found himself navigating attention he hadn't asked for. One afternoon, while adjusting a loose plank on the cabin's exterior, Tommy noticed a young boy from the valley watching him intently from a distance. The boy, maybe 10 years old, seemed both fascinated and nervous. Tommy approached cautiously. "You like building?" he asked. The boy nodded shyly. I tried making a treehouse, but it fell apart." Tommy smiled. Building takes patience, and sometimes it takes listening, not just to the wood, but to the place you're building on. The mountain talks if you pay attention. The boy's eyes widened. The mountain talks. Tommy chuckled softly. "In its own way, you'll learn. Want to help me fix this plank?" For the first time in weeks, Tommy felt the quiet satisfaction of teaching someone else, of passing along the lessons he had learned through trial and error. They worked together, careful and deliberate, and by the time the boy left, he was beaming with pride. But as spring deepened, the valley's storms returned with renewed intensity. Dark clouds gathered over the peaks, and the soil, still recovering from the last mudslide, threatened to shift once more. Tommy knew instinctively that this wasn't just another storm. It was a challenge, a test of everything he had learned, a chance to prove that his cabin was not only clever but durable. Late one night, as he lay in bed listening to the wind howl through the pines, he imagined the path of water and mud, the angles of his cabin, the fragile line between disaster and survival. Sleep was uneasy, filled with dreams of tumbling earth and rushing water, but he welcomed it. He had faced fear before, and he would face it again. By morning, the valley braced itself. Rumors of a potential flood spread quickly. Farmers moved livestock to higher ground, neighbors reinforced their homes, and the entire community waited, tense and silent, for the mountain to decide. Tommy, as always, checked the cabin. Everything was secure. Every post, every brace, every angle calculated. He felt ready, not invincible, but ready. And when the rain began to fall, heavy and relentless, the valley held its collective breath, knowing that the next test would define more than just Tommy's cabin. It would define the courage, the resilience, and the ingenuity of a boy who had refused to be mocked, even when the mountain itself seemed poised to strike. The storm hit with a ferocity the valley hadn't seen since the last mudslide. Rain pounded the slopes in sheets, hammering rooftops and flattening the soft soil beneath the trees. Winds tore through the pine needles like paper, and the creek that had once whispered now roared like a beast awakened from slumber. Tommy stood at the cabin doorway, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, eyes fixed on the slope below. The mudslide had returned, larger this time, surging down with a power that demanded respect. The neighbors, now gathered in small clusters, watched from safer distances, their faces pale with fear. This wasn't just a storm, it was a reckoning. The water and mud hit the mountain with an unrelenting force, tearing at rocks, dislodging trees, and carving new channels through the earth. The valley seemed to hold its breath as the torrent approached the ridge where Tommy's cabin stood, precariously tilted, yet still proud. Tommy had anticipated this. He had spent the last few weeks reinforcing the foundation, angling posts, and securing drainage channels to guide the water safely around the cabin. Every calculation, every adjustment, every sleepless night had led to this moment. The mudslide hit the ridge with a violent roar. Rocks and debris bounced off the slope, crashing into trees and skidding across the valley floor. Neighbors gasped, certain that the cabin would be obliterated in seconds. But it didn't. The water flowed around the cabin, exactly as Tommy had designed it. The tilt that had been mocked for years acted like a shield, guiding the torrent past the structure instead of allowing it to smash into the walls. Mud and debris struck the ridge Roman 6. Olently, but the cabin swayed slightly, absorbed the impact, and held its ground. Elaine watched from the farmhouse below, heart in her throat, clutching the railing until her knuckles whitened. When the slide passed, when the roar softened to a distant rumble, she ran toward the ridge, tears streaming down her face. Tommy emerged from the cabin, soaked and exhausted but unbroken. The mudslide had tested him and the cabin, and both had survived. The neighbors, previously skeptical and mocking, erupted into a mixture of cheers, stunned silence, and whispered apologies. Old man Jenkins muttered, "I'll be damned, I'll be damned." Even the reporters, cameras shaking in their hands, couldn't capture the gravity of the moment. Tommy's triumph wasn't just in the survival of a cabin. It was in defying expectations, proving that careful observation, ingenuity, and a little stubbornness could hold back forces that had seemed insurmountable. In the days that followed, the valley changed again. The path of destruction from the mudslide carved new channels, but homes and people were safe. The tilted cabin became a legend. Local news ran stories, online forums debated angles and techniques, and children in the valley began to dream of building their own impossible structures. Tommy's story spread beyond the mountains, inspiring articles, short documentaries, and even engineering students who wanted to study the cabin firsthand. Yet for Tommy, the victory was quieter, more personal. He walked the ridge alone at sunrise, looking down at the valley below, listening to the wind rustle through the recovering trees. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need applause. The mountain had tested him, and he had passed. One afternoon, a local boy approached him again. "Do you think I could build something like your cabin?" he asked, eyes wide with awe. Tommy knelt to meet his gaze, hands resting on his knees. "You can build anything," he said gently. "But you have to listen, not just to what you're building, but to the world around you. The mountain, nature, it teaches if you pay attention." The boy nodded, inspired and determined. Tommy smiled faintly, knowing that this was the true legacy of the cabin. Not the viral fame, not the headlines, but the lesson that courage, careful thought, and persistence could defy even the harshest odds. Spring faded into summer, and the valley slowly returned to its rhythms. The scar of the mudslide healed with new growth, and the neighbors, once skeptical, began to treat the mountain with newfound respect. Some even sought Tommy's advice when repairing their own structures, learning from the boy who had tilted a cabin and survived where others had feared. Late at night, Tommy would sometimes sit on the cabin's porch, listening to the wind and imagining the next challenge. He knew the mountain would always test him, always push him to think, adapt, and survive. But he also knew that with careful observation, ingenuity, and unwavering patience, he could face whatever came next. And so the tilted cabin remained, perched proudly on its ridge, a symbol of resilience, intelligence, and quiet defiance. What had once been mocked was now revered, a testament to the power of persistence and the rewards of trusting one's own instincts. Tommy looked at it one last time before heading inside, raincoat drying on a hook, tools neatly stacked. He felt a sense of completion and anticipation simultaneously. The mountain had challenged him, and he had met it head-on. But tomorrow and the days after that, there would be new challenges, new angles to calculate, new lessons to learn, and new moments to face with courage. Because in the end, it wasn't about the cabin. It was about understanding the mountain, respecting its power, and daring to stand firm when the world expected you to fall. And Tommy Harlan had done just that. The valley would remember him. The mountain would remember him. And most importantly, he would remember himself. The boy who tilted a cabin, endured laughter and doubt, and stood undefeated as the mudslide flowed right past it. The end.